you. So my talk today will focus on the acquisition of one of the largest and most important collections of works by the Russian master goldsmith and jeweler Carl Fabergé. And this collection is one of the most famous and significant of the decorative arts collection within the Royal Collection, which, as Michael said, I'm responsible for. It numbers between 850 and 900 pieces. The precise number not yet finally determined, as in the course of recent research, I've identified new pieces within the collection, but I've also discounted others which had previously been misattributed. While the collection may no longer be the largest of Fabergé in existence, it is regarded as exceptional in two ways. Firstly, in its extraordinary diversity, being representative of every type of object which the Fabergé workshops produced, from relatively ordinary table silver to the most elaborate jeweled Easter eggs. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, because of the manner in which the collection was formed. The collection really is the product of 5 successive generations of royal collecting and accumulation from the reign of Queen Victoria to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Moreover, it is unique in being the only extant collection to have been formed, for the most part, prior to the Russian Revolution of 1917, making it comparable with only with the collections of the Russian imperial family themselves, which of course after the revolution were confiscated and dispersed. By 1887, Queen Victoria had succeeded in the ambition she had shared with Prince Albert, her consort, to marry her children and her grandchildren into the most significant royal and princely houses of Europe. Her dynastic ambition realized, she chose the Danish artist Lawrence Regnier Tuxen to paint 3 generations of her family in the green drawing room at Windsor Castle to mark her Golden Jubilee, which took place that year. And we see that remarkable group portrait here in front of us. And even though the Prince Consort had sadly died many years earlier, you can see to the right of the screen a bronze bust on the chimneypiece representing her dearly beloved husband. 11 years later, in October 1896, she received her favorite granddaughter, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, born Princess Alix of Hesse and by Rhine, consort of the last Emperor of Russia, Nicholas II, at Balmoral Castle, where they stayed for a period of 10 days. This photograph is one of many recorded during that visit, and it also shows the future Edward VII, who was the Emperor's uncle, and of course, Nicholas and Alexandra's first child, Grand Duchess Olga. Queen Victoria, by this date, had already made purchases with the Fabergé firm, and her account ledgers refer to payments made in 1895 and then again in 1897 for brooches, etc. And we believe that these were probably in connection with her Diamond Jubilee of 1897. And for that highly significant occasion, Nicholas II and Alexandra commissioned Carl Fabergé to make a brooch for the Queen, and it takes the form of a silver and gold heart set with brilliant diamonds, surmounted by a cabochon sapphire and with 2 further sapphires suspended from diamond pompile or chains below. The heart encloses a diamond-set Slavonic characters for the number 60, of course, for the 60 years of the Diamond Jubilee. The brooch cost 1,055 rubles, quite a substantial sum, and the Queen, clearly delighted with it, chose to wear it for the official celebrations of her Diamond Jubilee on the 23rd of June, 1897. And in a telegram offering their congratulations on her Jubilee, the Emperor and Empress wrote to the Queen, "Touched that you wore our present." For Christmas the previous year, they had also sent another gift of Fabergé, which the Queen also chose to deploy on the occasion of her Jubilee. And here you can see this silver gilt and guilloche enameled notebook case, inscribed on the top right by the couple themselves, and dedicated by Queen Victoria herself on the slide below. And inside, every single page is signed by all of the crowned heads of Europe and the wider world that attended the Jubilee celebrations. It's not really within the scope of this lecture today to give a very detailed account of Carl Fabergé's career or indeed the history of the firm, both of which are of course extremely well documented and very widely published. But it is important to note the main influences on his work, which ultimately led to imperial and royal patronage and made him the most successful Russian goldsmith and jeweler of the 19th and 20th century. Karl's father, Gustav Fabergé, was born in 1814, and he became a master goldsmith in 1841, having been apprenticed to Johann Kebel, and he opened a workshop in St. Petersburg in the same year. In 1860, he moved his family, including his son Peter Karl Fabergé, who'd been born in 1846, to Dresden, and it was here that Karl attended a commercial course and became fascinated by the treasures of the Green Vault, notably those made by the famous Dinglinger family, which showed technical virtuosity and complexity, and most importantly, combined metalwork, enameling, and the use of precious and semi-precious stones, often in equal measure, so that no one element detracted from the other. Fabergé was also influenced by the automata that he saw there, which were particularly well represented in the collections of the Grünes Gewalt. In completion of his training, he traveled to Frankfurt, where he was apprenticed to the jeweler Friedman, and he also visited Florence and Paris, although those visits are not particularly well documented. He returned to St. Petersburg in 1870 as a fully fledged craftsman to take over his father's business. In 1882, Fabergé and his craftsmen, in particular the goldsmith Eric Collin, who was Fabergé's first headwork master, were inspired to make reproductions of the famous Kirch Scythian antiquities, and these were exhibited at the Pan-Russian exhibition in Moscow in 1882. And you can see on the top right of the screen a reproduction image of some of the pieces that were made. Contemporary accounts of that exhibition record that Fabergé's work was extremely highly regarded, and the pieces exhibited were immediately recognized as objets d'art, standing apart from the other more mass-produced style of jewelry submitted by other Russian exhibitors. The popular Russian journal Niva dedicated an article to these pieces, and the resulting display went on to attract the attention of the visiting Emperor Alexander III and his consort Maria Feodorovna, who herself made her first purchase of Fabergé in the form of a pair of cufflinks in the shape of cicadas. The public and imperial recognition of his gold jewelry marked a major turning point in the firm's history, and 3 years later, on the 1st of May 1885, Carl Fabergé was granted the official title of supplier to the imperial court, with the right to bear the imperial coat of arms on his shop and also within the stamped boxes that he retailed his products in. The duality of patronage and collecting, and one could also argue the stratospheric success which the firm began to enjoy, was largely attributable to 2 Danish princesses. Alexandra, that we see on the left of the screen, the consort of the future King Edward VII, whom she married in 1863, and Dagmar, the consort of the future Emperor Alexander III, who took the name Maria Feodorovna on her marriage in 1866, and we see her in this beautiful frame on the right of the screen. Both were daughters of Christian IX and Queen Louise of Denmark, and their adoration of Fabergé's work would help to transform his business into a nationwide enterprise with branches in Moscow, Kiev, and Odessa, and ultimately into an international endeavour with the opening of the London branch, from which sales trips were made to the continent in order to serve the demands of European royalty, and even as far afield as to the royal family in Thailand. The Danish homeland of the 2 sisters was, however, never far from Fabergé's mind, and was often referenced in the commissions he undertook for both the Russian imperial family and the British royal family. In 1885, Alexander III commissioned the first of the famous series of 50 imperial Easter eggs. Known as the first hen egg, it is traditionally connected with an 18th century egg in the Danish royal collection, which is itself part of a mid-18th century tradition of similar objects, of which at least 2 other examples are known. The highest order of chivalry in Denmark, the Order of the Elephant, and you see the badge of that order on the top right of the screen, was also incorporated into an imperial egg, becoming the surprise, the object hidden inside the egg, designed to delight the Empress on Easter Day when she opened up and received her wonderful egg. And it became the surprise for the 1892 diamond trellis imperial Easter egg. And we see the surprise on the bottom of the screen beneath the badge of the order. And when we look at these two, we see that unlike the badge of the order, Fabergé's version is actually made in ivory, and it's also an automaton, and you can just see that the sections of the legs are separate components, and also that the underneath, you can just glimpse underneath the feet that, oh, sorry, that was an accident. Apologies. Oh, what's happened? There we go. And you can just glimpse underneath the back foot that there's a little gold wheel, and these are ratcheted, and it's this that enables the automaton to move along when it's wound. And also it moves its head up and down much in the manner of an actual elephant. And this surprise was acquired by King George V and Queen Mary in 1935, who were unaware at that time of its origin. And it was quietly sitting, minding its own business on a shelf in a display cabinet in Buckingham Palace without having been moved ever since its acquisition, until I came along a few years later and identified it as the missing Fabergé surprise for the imperial diamond trellis egg. And it hadn't been seen in public since 1929, so that's almost 90 years subsequently. Having been introduced to Fabergé's work by her sister, Marie Fyodorovna, Queen Alexandra began to formulate her own collection. And the pieces she acquired were mainly in the form of gifts exchanged for anniversaries, for birthdays, for Easter, and for Christmas. And she began to develop quite a refined taste for the kinds of pieces that she liked. According to the manager of the London branch of the firm, Henry Charles Bainbridge, Queen Alexandra preferred pieces in the more modest price bracket with a strict limit of £50. And these included jewelled, enamelled and hardstone flowers, of which she collected the majority of those 26 examples, which are now in the royal collection. And on the left of the screen, you can see this wonderful gold, nephrite and enamelled chrysanthemum. And this, in fact, was a gift to Queen Alexandra from the counselor at the Russian embassy, Stanislas Pokrovsky-Kozyl. And this was purchased at a cost price of £117, well exceeding the price limit that had been set, but demonstrating, of course, the technical ingenuity required to make the flowers, which of course consequently made them incredibly expensive. And these flowers were really inspired by jeweled bouquets, which had been made by the court jeweler Jérémie Pausier and others, and also by Chinese hardstone carvings of flowers that were to be found in the Hermitage collection. But they're also an example of how Fabergé sought really to push the boundaries of traditional Russian hardstone carving, reducing the scale and using varieties of stones to replicate fresh and decayed berries, for example, leaves, as we see here with these very finely carved nephrite elements, as well as the trompe-l'œil effect of water refracted through glass, which is what we believe we see when we look at this piece. But in reality, the vase is formed of a solid piece of carved and polished rock crystal, designed to look as though it is in fact water in a glass vase. Queen Alexandra also began what is now the largest collection of carved hardstone animals by the Fabergé firm, and it numbers in excess of 350, 3 times as large, in fact, as the collection formed by her sister in Russia. The animals drew on numerous sources, including Netsuke, of which Carl Fabergé owned a considerable collection. And we can see in this example, Queen Alexandra's dormouse, so called, the kind of density of the carving is very, very reminiscent of that style of carving that we see in Japanese Netsuke. Frames with portrait miniatures and photographs were also in great demand by Fabergé's clientele, largely, of course, due to the rise in the popularity of photography. The private apartments of Queen Alexandra, which we'll see a little later on, groaned with photographs of family, and she was indeed an accomplished amateur photographer herself. But she also received numerous gifts of Fabergé frames, and this particular example with a miniature is thought to have been a gift marking the silver jubilee of her parents, Christian IX and Queen Louise. Exquisitely enameled boxes and frames of gold or hardstones set with seed pearls and diamonds and enamel also featured views of famous monuments and palaces in Russia. And Fabergé decided to extend that range of boxes and frames from the Russian views to encompass those of significance to the British royal family. And some of these were acquired by Queen Alexandra and by Edward VII, and then later by King George V and Queen Mary. And they included, as you can see here, views of their beloved Sandringham House in Norfolk, of famous monuments, the Houses of Parliament. And so on the right-hand side, you also see a view of what was known as Queen Alexandra's Dairy on the Norfolk estate. You see a photograph of it below. And then in the centre, a bonbonniere, the two sides of a bonbonniere, one showing Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Windsor Castle on the other side. Such was the association with Sandringham that this was where, in fact, the majority of Queen Alexandra's collection was kept, mainly in two very large display cases in the drawing room, which were specially lit by electric lights every evening to show the collection off to the best advantage. And although this photograph of the drawing room at Sandringham House is taken a little bit later, 9 years after Queen Alexandra's death, actually, she died in 1925, the room has changed very little. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can just see a glass-fronted cabinet with glass shelves, and there are two of those to the right, and they are the ones that contained her collection. Prior to acceding to the throne, Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, as Prince and Princess of Wales, resided at Marlborough House. And it was here that photographs in an album captioned by the Queen herself reveal the way in which, while some pieces were kept in vitrines, others were dotted around the room. And this is another image from that same album. This actually is of Queen Alexandra's dressing room at Sandringham House. And you can just see the density of objects and books and all sorts of things around. And then when we look at this image, again, a sort of similar approach at the London residence, Marlborough House. And this, in fact, shows Queen Alexandra in her sitting room. And on the table to the left, which I show an enlarged image of on the right, you can just make out a whole array of Fabergé animals. But in fact, dotted in amongst them, right in the center of the image, you can just make out this wonderful bowenite and gold Fabergé clock. So showing that she liked to mix and match the objects all around. The patronage of the Queen, and as we shall soon see, of the King himself, was one of the major factors which really influenced Carl Fabergé to open the only foreign outpost of his business in London. It was a retail business only, there were no workshops, and it opened first at Berners Hotel in 1903. It moved to Portman House in Dover Street in 1904. It moved to 48 Dover Street in 1906. And then finally, from 1911 until its closure in 1915, it was situated at the very prestigious address of 173 New Bond Street. The branch was managed from 1907 by Henry Charles Bainbridge, and initially this was jointly with Nicholas Fabergé, one of Carl's sons. And the branch was regularly visited by the King and Queen and many members of the royal family, either to purchase pieces for themselves or as gifts for one another. And alongside this very famous photograph of George V with his cousin Nicholas II, his first cousin, where they look so alike. This is a quote from Bainbridge's autobiography, and he sums up there all the amazing noble and royal families who would come to visit the branch on a regular basis. Like Queen Alexandra, King Edward VII was a fervent admirer of Fabergé's work and acquired a really considerable collection himself through a variety of different means. For example, in 1908, he made a state visit to Russia to visit his nephew, Emperor Nicholas II. And this visit, rather unusually, was actually conducted afloat, as it was considered far too dangerous for the king to set foot on Russian soil at this particular time. And so, with their two families in tow, they bobbed up and down between the Royal Yacht the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert and the Imperial Yachts Standard and Polar Star. And on this occasion, the emperor presented the king with an official gift made by the Fabergé firm, this very large enameled and gem-set nephrite bowl. Its commissioning as a diplomatic gift through the imperial cabinet was nothing new for Fabergé, as he regularly made a variety of gifts to be given in the name of the emperor. Edward VII also acquired pieces which were deeply connected to his personal interests, from cigar cases and lighters to frames and other objects, many of which were enamelled in his own, the royal racing colours, as you see in the red and blue striped enamel frame on the left. And he also commissioned a sculpture of his most successful racehorse, Persimmon, who's likewise depicted in the photograph frame. The rise of cigarette and cigar smoking superseded that of snuff-taking from the end of the 19th century, and Fabergé, in consummate retail style, responded accordingly by producing some of the most sumptuously decorated and elegant accessories, of which the king was to form a very large collection. And here we have two really wonderful examples. In 1903, his sister-in-law, Marie Fyodorovna, commissioned this beautiful two-color gold cigarette case with the monogram of the king and queen, E and A, Edward and Alexandra, crowned in diamonds, as a 40th wedding anniversary present. And a few years later, in 1908, the case on the right of the screen was given to the king by his mistress, Mrs. George Keppel, who's actually seated in front of the king in the photograph taken at Sandringham House there on the top right of the screen. And this is probably one of the most sumptuous and elegant pieces made by the firm, particularly in the wonderfully exuberant and highly successful guilloché enameling, for which, of course, the Fabergé firm was renowned. And it also features, as you can see, this incredibly elegant and very sinuous diamond-set snake, which continues over the other side of the case as well. And of course, the symbol of the snake biting its tail is, in fact, the symbol of everlasting love. And of course, what we can see from this case, in contrast to the one on the left of the screen, is it's incredibly, very much in the Art Nouveau style. And rather interestingly, we don't see a huge amount of evidence of this style in Fabergé's work. And so much so that actually in 1900, when he exhibited at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, with many of his pieces being in the kind of neoclassical revival style, he was actually quite criticized for the lack of Art Nouveau pieces, which of course had then come to the forefront in European stylistic terms. And he then began to, after that, experiment increasingly with objects in what was known in Russia as the style moderne. And that also, of course, found favor with Alexandra Fyodorovna, one of clearly his most important imperial clients. And this case had a rather fascinating history, because after the king died, Queen Alexandra gave it back to Mrs. Keppel as a memento in 1910. But in turn, some more than 20 years later, Mrs. Keppel decided to return it, and she gave it to Queen Mary, thereby ensuring that it would actually remain in the royal collection, where, of course, it is still to this day. Gifts and purchases, as I've described, were obviously one means of accumulation for the king. But in 1907, he decided to place the only documented commission, direct royal commission, with the Fabergé firm to make portrait models of the favourite dogs and racehorses kept on the estate at Sandringham. And this was designed to be a present for Queen Alexandra. And what turned out was that this became the largest commission ever ordered through the London firm. And clearly it was quite a major undertaking. And of course, with no workshops in London, Bainbridge had to arrange with Carl Fabergé for craftsmen to be dispatched from Russia. And as a result, a number of sculptors came from the St. Petersburg headquarters, and they stayed on the estate in Norfolk and set to work mainly actually in Queen Alexandra's dairy, which we saw a few slides ago. And they made small wax models from life, portraits of all the dogs and horses. And these would then be, once they'd been approved by the king, were dispatched back to Russia to be translated into the relevant hardstone, which of course was very carefully selected by the pietra dura, the stone carvers in Fabergé's workshops. And amongst those sculptors was a very famous one, Boris Freudmann Cluzel, and he had also worked on sculpting portraits for one of the king's friends, Leopold de Rothschild, on his estate at Ascot in Buckinghamshire. And so successful was this commission and so well received by the king and queen that it was in fact extended to include a whole range of other animals kept on the estate, from Dexter cattle that you see down on the left-hand side to Norfolk black turkeys, so identifiable breeds that are very much associated with the estate and with the east of England. One of the final purchases of the king at the London branch was this wonderful hardstone composite carving on the right of the screen of a Chelsea pensioner. And this is one of only 2 hardstone carvings made by the firm, which represents an English type of figure. The Chelsea pensioner is not identifiable with a specific individual, but of course, some of the Russian types that the Fabergé firm produced are indeed actual portrait models. And so on the left of the screen, you see, commissioned by Nicholas II, were 2 portrait sculptures, in fact, of Cossack bodyguards of the imperial family. And this one is of a Kudinov, the personal bodyguard of the emperor's mother, Empress Marie Feodorovna. The children of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra became early collectors of Fabergé, particularly the future King George V and also his sister, Princess Victoria. As Duke and Duchess of York, and also as Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King George V and his consort, Queen Mary, who you see in the frames, Fabergé frames on the screen, were regular customers of the London branch, and each developed their very own particular taste for aspects of Fabergé's work. For their coronation in 1911, they were presented with this very large carved rock crystal vase mounted in gold in a neo-Renaissance style with strapwork enamel, and also set with cabochon precious stones. And this was a gift from the great friend of the royal family, who I mentioned earlier, Leopold de Rothschild. And he had the vase delivered actually directly to the king and queen at Buckingham Palace on the morning of their coronation. And indeed, it was filled with orchids, which he had grown in his garden at Gunnersbury, his house just outside London. And both the recently discovered archive of Henry Charles Bainbridge, which is now housed in the Fabergé Museum in St. Petersburg, together with photographs of Fabergé's workshop, show the vase unmounted in the design studio. And I'm showing one of those images here. You can see, I hope, just at the front left side of the workbench on the sort of back wall facing us is the vase, but it's actually unmounted. You can just make out the carving on the body of the vase. And this is rather interesting because great haste was required to have the vase mounted and then for the rock crystal to actually be engraved with the arms and the date of the coronation. And correspondence recently found in the archive of the Royal Society of Sculptors here in London has revealed that the time available to engrave the vase didn't permit having it sent back to Russia. And so instead, the engraving was actually carried out in London by a sculptor and medalist called Cecil Thomas. And he actually undertook his particular part of the carving, which was the royal arms and the date of the coronation, using a dental drill. George V was particularly keen on animal carvings, rather like his mother, Queen Alexandra. And in this image, which is a close-up of the interior of the London branch of the firm at 173 New Bond Street, a remarkable carving of a water buffalo in chalcedony with ivory horns can just be seen on the top shelf to the left. You can just make out the horns. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up here. And here is the actual sculpture. It's just such a wonderful piece of carving, and it's absolutely remarkable that in Fabergé's hardstone carvings, although this is probably only about 7 or 8 centimeters in length and about 4 or 5 centimeters high, you can see that the stone has been so carefully selected. It has this gradation of color, which kind of mimics the actual coloring of the animal. It's very well posed in very, very naturalistic way. And then you have this wonderful translucency through the legs down to the hooves. And we can see also in a rare surviving invoice in the Royal Archives, which are kept at Windsor Castle, the actual purchase of this piece. And you can see there listed on the invoice that he actually bought a number of other animals, a kangaroo, the Indian cow, which is the piece we're looking at on the right of the screen, a bear and a camel. And the bear, in fact, is a koala. And also he purchased some very inexpensive wooden cigarette cases on the same day. And you'll also note that he received some discount, about 10% discount as well. So that is probably an indication of what good customers the royal family were of the firm. The King and Queen commissioned frames with miniatures of their children, and one of the most famous examples is this beautiful carved smoky quartz cameo of their eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII. And this, in fact, was commissioned to mark his investiture as Prince of Wales in 1911. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the original record of the production of this piece in a design album from the workshop of Henrik Wigström, who was the third of the 3 head workmasters in the Fabergé firm. He was of Finnish extraction. And so it's wonderful to be able to match those 2 things up. And we know that George V purchased this at a cost of £67 and 10 shillings. And he actually gave it to Queen Mary as a memento of this obviously highly important occasion for her birthday. And in fact, it's possible that Cecil Thomas, who I mentioned earlier in connection with the coronation vase, also actually engraved this cameo in London. Queen Mary's taste encompassed gold, hardstone and gem-set boxes, many of which were in fact gifts to her, several of which were gifts from the imperial family, so her family through her husband. And they include this beautiful, very simple but very elegant nephrite box on the top left, which was a gift to Queen Mary for Christmas in 1912 from Marie Fyodorovna. And also an example below, which demonstrates Fabergé's revival of French 18th century gold boxes with quatre couleurs decoration and also set with a moss agate panel at the top. And this, in fact, was given to Queen Mary when she was Duchess of York for Christmas in 1894 by the Emperor Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna. And in addition, Queen Mary added some very significant examples of the wonderful flower studies, including this very beautiful example of Bleeding Heart or Digitalis, which in fact she actually purchased herself in 1934. And just to give an idea of the way in which Queen Mary liked to keep her Fabergé collection on display. This is a photograph of a cabinet in Buckingham Palace in about 1934. And as you can see very clearly, pieces of Fabergé are mingled with all sorts of other objects, ceramics, Oriental and South Asian pieces. Although this looks rather sort of jumbled up, it was how she preferred to present her collection and to live with her collection. But although it appears to be perhaps slightly disorganized, she in fact is someone that we regard almost as the first royal curator of the royal collection, because she actually carefully documented all of her collections in her volumes of so-called bibelots. so small works of art. And she compiled these very diligently between 1893 and 1937. The role of the dealer and of purchasers at auction also became important in the collecting of King George V and Queen Mary. And their acquisitions, of course, straddled both the pre- and the post-revolutionary periods in Russia. Artworks confiscated from the imperial family and other noble Russian families had to be evaluated in Moscow. And this was a process which Karl Fabergé's son, Agathon, was actually forced to undertake himself. So he would have seen many of the most important pieces that his father's firm had created. And once they'd been evaluated and a decision was made, they were then, those that were to be sold for hard currency by the Russian government were then designated for sale through the Sovnarkom and the antiquariat. And of course, they began to flood onto the open market in London from the sort of 1920s and into the 1930s. And Queen Mary very actively attended sale views at the major London auction houses, and she also visited the premises of notable London dealers such as Wartsky. And her visits, of course, were in fact documented, and this encouraged an interest in the market for Russian decorative art at that early period in the 20s and 30s. Her visits were noted in the Court Circular, which is disseminated through newspapers nationally and in magazines and so on and so forth. And on one such visit to a dealer in 1947, according to the newspaper The Daily Telegraph, she actually caused a traffic jam when she visited one particular dealer to make purchases. And as she emerged, the crowd surged forward and cheering and waving. So these events became quite significant and quite well noted in the press. And in addition, having been this wonderful sort of curator of her own collection, she also began to make loans from the Fabergé collection to exhibitions, including to the early and very groundbreaking Russian exhibition, which was held in Belgrave Square in London in 1935, and again a few years later to the Antique Dealers Fair and exhibition at Grosvenor House in 1948. So these were very early examples of loans from the Fabergé collection in royal ownership. And even after her death, an exhibition of her most treasured possessions from Marlborough House, where she had lived after King George V's death, was mounted at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And the exhibits were arranged to coincide with the rooms in which she had very carefully placed her collection. And among those treasures was one of the 3 imperial Easter eggs, which she purchased with the king. And here we see on the screen exactly that imperial egg, which, as you can see, is known as the basket of flowers egg for very obvious reasons. And this she had purchased, in fact, in 1933. And this is just one of the most exquisite examples of Fabergé's enamel and gold work. And you can see in the detail on the right of the screen, those are absolutely beautiful, highly detailed, and almost, sort of hyper realistic in their naturalness, the flowers and the grasses. You can see the little oats, which in fact in gold are actually set en tremblant, so that when there's the slightest movement, they move. And all of the flowers are situated in a bed of gold moss. And then the whole sits in this egg-shaped vase with, of course, the date 1901. And interestingly, when this was first acquired by Queen Mary, it wasn't actually thought to be a work by Fabergé. For many, many years, it was regarded as possibly having been made by the French jeweler and goldsmith Boucheron. But of course, subsequently, once it was possible to establish more of the facts, it was, of course, acknowledged as the imperial egg given by Nicholas II to Alexandra Feodorovna in 1901. The second of the 2 eggs acquired by Queen Mary and George V is the colonnade egg of 1910, which you see on the screen here. And you can also see on the top left-hand side a note in Queen Mary's handwriting recording the history of the piece and explaining what the piece actually depicts. And of course, this is a rather wonderful piece. It's actually a clock. So you can see the egg, the pink enameled egg at the top, has a rotary clock around the top. And originally, the little puto situated on top held in his outstretched right hand an arrow which would point to the hour. And there's also a little diamond arrow which pops out from the top of the colonnade as well, which would help to indicate the minutes. And as I say, this was purchased by Queen Mary in 1931, and it represents a classical temple of love, which is totally telling the story of the imperial family. And so within the colonnade are a pair of doves, which are actually executed in platinum. So it's quite an unusual early example of work in platinum. And they represent the emperor and the empress, Alexandra and Nicholas. Seated around the base are these four female figures. They are all very slightly different, and they of course represent their four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, linked by these wonderful garlands of flowers in four-colored gold. And then the puto that I referred to earlier, seated on top, is of course the long-awaited heir to the throne, the Cesarevich Alexei. And so this is a wonderfully intimate piece, which would of course have made such impact when it was presented on Easter Day. And the third of the three imperial eggs, now in the royal collection, acquired by King George V and Queen Mary, is this one, probably one of the most famous of Fabergé's imperial eggs, the so-called mosaic egg, which George V actually purchased in 1933 from a London dealer called Cameo Corner, not far from the British Museum, if you know the British Museum. And he purchased it for what seems like the incredibly reasonable price of £250, which actually then was still rather a lot of money. But it's somewhat ironic, because actually recent research has shown that this, in fact, was the most expensive imperial egg ever made by the Fabergé firm. And this is presumably because of its technical virtuosity. And the egg, which you can perhaps see more clearly from the sort of aerial view on the left-hand side of the screen, is actually formed of a cage of platinum, which has been entirely cut by hand. This is not machine made in any way. It's set with precious and semi-precious stones, as you can see, with this design, which, although of course suggests mosaic, in fact, hence the name of the egg, in fact was inspired by the designer of the egg, Alma Peel, by her mother-in-law, sitting by the fire working on her needlepoint. And I think when you look at the floral, the sort of stylized floral motifs in those precious and semi-precious stones, you can really now begin to see why and how it was inspired by that particular activity. And of course, it's set with these wonderful bands of seed pearls, of white enamel, diamonds, and these wonderful sort of wave motifs of diamonds. And on the right-hand screen, the object next to the egg is, of course, the surprise. And we saw the elephant automaton surprise earlier. And this is simply a sort of rather classical cameo on this wonderfully jeweled and enameled base. The cameo is surmounted by the Russian imperial crown, and you can see the portraits of the 5 imperial children in this sort of en cameo painted enamel. So after the wonderful collecting of King George V and Queen Mary, it's really, I would say, the successor to Queen Mary in terms of Fabergé connoisseurship within the royal family was her daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, consort of King George VI. And you see her here in this wonderful Fabergé frame, dating from about 1900, but which in fact was actually a gift for the King and Queen's coronation in 1937 from the Maharaja of Bikaner. And he had this photograph inserted of the Queen at the time of the King's accession. And Queen Elizabeth actually formed a really remarkably broad-ranging collection of Fabergé from the 1940s right through into the 1990s. So we're very much in the latter decades of her life. And she collected pieces, particularly those made in the Moscow branch, which are more perhaps artistically different and sophisticated than many of the objects collected by earlier monarchs. And they include this neo-Russian style cloisonné enamel coffre, excuse me, which was made by Fabergé's excuse me, workmaster Theodore Ruckert. And in contrast to that, again, rather more challenging in style, but very elegant nonetheless, this beautiful pair of ruby crystal decanters, which are surmounted by these classical silver, beautifully chased and modelled dolphin heads, which act as both the handles but also the spouts. Queen Elizabeth also added two very significant flower studies to the collection. On the left, you can see the cornflowers and oats, and on the right, the wonderful cornflowers and buttercups. And the buttercup, as you can see, is actually applied with a jeweled bee, which is just landing on the petals, a really extraordinary tour de force of the jeweler's art. And the cornflowers and oats actually was a joint purchase with her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, in June 1944 from the firm of Wartski. And the price was £144. And of course, 1944, we were still in the Second World War. And remarkably enough, Queen Elizabeth decided to keep this flower in her shelter during the Blitz in Buckingham Palace. Which is sort of extraordinary, thinking this highly fragile, very, very beautiful object, particularly with those oats, again, that we saw on the basket of flowers egg, that move en tremblant. One can just imagine the bombs dropping around and this object shaking. Anyway, it survived, which is very good news. But in a note to her mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth described the cornflowers and oats as a charming thing and remarkably unwarlike. So perhaps it was the fact that it was just so uplifting and so beautiful that she decided to keep it there for inspiration in those very, very dark days of the Second World War. And it was 3 years later that she decided to add the cornflowers and buttercup study, which she purchased for the somewhat larger sum of £375. The king himself added quite a number of gold and enamelled cigarette cases and boxes, and this very much added to the collection, which had been established, of course, initially by Edward VII, added to by King George V, and then subsequently by King George VI. And he also, and we can see these wonderful examples on the right-hand side, these absolutely beautiful, very, very satisfying, very tactile cigarette cases, beautifully shaped, perfect for use, which indeed they were used, and in these wonderful designs in different coloured golds, which are just so exquisite. And he also purchased this wonderful imperial presentation box with a portrait of the emperor. And this is actually one of the most exceptional examples, I think, of Fabergé's guilloché enameling on an object of this type, with this incredible, beautiful pale lilac color, wonderful moire design, which seems to be incredibly three-dimensional when one is fortunate enough to hold this box and move it around in the light. It's absolutely beautiful. And this had originally been purchased by, purchased through the Imperial Cabinet and given in the name of Nicholas II to the Russian Privy Councillor Artur Germanovich Rafalovich in 1914. But having been able to match it to the original design drawing in the Wikström album, which you see beneath the box, you can see that actually it was once actually intended to be surmounted by the diamond set cipher of the emperor, rather than the rather more valuable portrait miniature, which presumably was more befitting of the rank of Rafalovich, as set out, of course, in the table of ranks, which was established many, many years before by Peter the Great, but remarkably still in use in the 20th century. The fifth generation of royal collectors really brings us to the end of this survey, very brief survey of the collection. And of course, the present generation of Her Majesty the Queen, who's added a number of pieces, largely through purchase, but also with some gifts. And in 1959, one of her few purchases is this clock, blue enamel clock, which she purchased from the firm of Wartski. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we see another clock, in this instance bequeathed to His late Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. who was, of course, of direct Romanov descent. And this was actually a gift or a bequest to him from his aunt, Queen Louise of Sweden, in 1965. And she herself had been given the clock by the Duke's grandmother, Queen Olga of Greece, who, of course, was born Grand Duchess Olga of Russia. And I think one of the unique features of this remarkable collection is the fact that objects from it are still in use, or indeed still furnish the royal residences. And this includes the London home of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who has also added pieces to the collection, including this rather amusing frog seal, which you see in the centre of the screen, which he was given in 1981. In conclusion, we have learned today about just a few of the wonderful many highlights of this extraordinary collection of collections. And I think what it demonstrates is the enduring admiration for Fabergé's craftsmanship, but also the royal family's delight in his ever inventive creations. What really comes across very strongly, and what I hope you will take away, of course, are how important those family connections are. And as you've seen, bound up in almost every piece, redolent of some of Fabergé's greatest work. But I think we also learn about the intimate, personal, and the regularly used pieces that were not mere trophies, but beloved family possessions, which of course they remain to this day. Thank you.
Again, I'll begin with a little bit of a broad question here. The individual asks, may I ask if there is still work to do in cataloging Fabergé pieces? And in addition to this first part, which monarch was the most prolific in collecting Fabergé?
Okay, good question. So for part one, and I think I've now really completed, in effect, what is a recataloguing of this amazing collection and all its up to its sort of 900 pieces. And that's something I've been working on over a number of years in preparation for the publication of my catalogue, which I hope will come out in a not too distant future. So no, I think that work is completed. And secondly, I think for part two of the question, you've seen a sort of 5-6 generations of the royal family as collectors, but I think almost certainly, probably in terms of numbers, in terms of volume of pieces, it would certainly be Queen Alexandra. She was really, as I said, with her sister Maria Feodorovna, they were the two that really sort of pushed forward, and I suppose created this through their family connections, through this these sort of a lot of gift exchange, this market really for Fabergé's work, which of course filtered down through the elite of society and then into the sort of industrialists and through broader society. And so I would say Queen Alexandra, probably in terms of the sheer number of pieces now in the collection which were acquired by her.
Fantastic, thank you. So next individual asks, did Queen Elizabeth II wear the 60th Jubilee brooch made for Victoria on her 60th Jubilee?
A very good question. For Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee, no, she didn't. Marking Her Majesty the Queen's Diamond Jubilee were quite a number of events. We had a sort of weekend with wonderful events, including a service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral. And if my memory serves me correctly, which it might not, I believe Her Majesty wore two of the wonderful Cullinan diamonds from the famous Cullinan diamond, the largest diamond ever discovered in history, the Cullinan 3 and 4, which are worn in the form of a brooch. So she didn't wear that particular brooch on that occasion, but I can say that Her Majesty does lend that brooch, and indeed it's quite often worn by the Duchess of Cornwall, the consort of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. So it is worn, it is still worn within the family.
All right, so keeping on with this train of thought of items within your presentation, one of our guests asks, in the basket of flowers 1901 Easter egg, were the flowers made of ceramic? They look so incredibly real. How did something so delicate survive the revolution, moving, and just, well, time?
I often ask myself the same question, to be honest. But no, they're not ceramic. All of the, well, the whole egg, effectively the body of the egg, the handle, and the base are made of silver and gold. The egg itself, you can conveniently, I hope you can still see it on the screen. I'm not sure, I hope you can. Is the body of the egg is enameled in that wonderful white guilloche or oyster guilloche enamel set with that diamond trellis pattern. But the flowers themselves, although they look perhaps a little bit like ceramic, they're actually all gold and silver, and then enamel applied with different types of enamel. And I think you can see the pansies and the daisies and the cornflowers and the, beautiful, beautiful things. So they're not ceramic, they are enamel. In terms of its survival and how on earth this object, which really is incredibly fragile, has survived the passage of time and the kind of tumultuous period of the revolution itself. Again, it is rather surprising, and in fact it did, we believe, sustain some damage in its history. So we see that the basket, the egg-shaped basket, is actually in that oyster enamel, but the base is actually in blue. And originally, I believe that the base was actually also in oyster enamel, and there is a surviving invoice which seems to indicate that there were repairs to the enamel. So we have to sort of weigh up the balance between the images of this egg when it was lent by Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna to an exhibition in St. Petersburg in 1902, with as I say, with this invoice which indicates that there was some damage, but the flowers themselves, which are probably the most fragile part, appear to have survived completely intact, which is completely remarkable. But obviously it's very well looked after now.
Thank you. So next question here. The comparison of the mosaic egg to needlework is obvious. Is there any sign of the influence of something like Roman micromosaic?
Really good question, actually. Yes, I think it does put us in mind of wonderful micromosaic, the tiny, tiny, those little tiny paterae, the little tiny squares that would be the equivalent of a mosaic are, I think that's absolutely a really good observation. And I think that micromosaic analogy is a very good one. So yes, I would agree. And that obviously would seem to, be another factor in the naming of the egg too.
Of course, thank you. So next questions here, I'm going to put a little bit of two questions together from two different attendees. First is going to be, which Fabergé work is your favorite? The individual's favorite is the Imperial Lilies of the Valley. And to add on to that inquiry, what sources do you suggest if there are members of the audience that want to learn more about the history of Fabergé and collection pieces?
Okay, so my favorite piece, well, gosh, it's almost impossible to say it because, of course, there are just so many wonderful pieces out there, not just in Her Majesty the Queen's collection. But if I limit myself, perhaps, to the royal collection, of course, the eggs are extraordinary and amazing, and I do really adore the mosaic egg. I think every time I have the great privilege of handling it and looking at it, it never ceases to amaze me how extraordinary it is. But having said that, I would say that beautiful blue Art Nouveau style cigarette case with a snake, I think is one of the most elegant, one of the most luxurious. It has this fantastic story, this amazing provenance, and it still, in fact, has inside it the stub of one of Edward VII's cigars. So it feels very real. It feels as though it could have been put down, yesterday. Having been used by a member of the family, which I hasten to add, it isn't used today. But I think that is probably really, really exquisite. In terms of resources, of course, as I said right back at the beginning, I didn't want to go into a sort of massive history of the whole firm because it's extremely well documented. There are absolutely wonderful publications out there, and almost too numerous, I think, to mention. But I think if again I could just turn it back to the collection, please do go onto our website where you can find information about every single piece in the collection, and our website rct.uk, and you'll find lots of images and lots of lovely material there. And then just Google Fabergé and you'll find a whole raft of wonderful publications.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to leave things off with a final question for you here before going into some closing remarks. But are there cases designed to hold these pieces, eggs in particular, that have survived?
Again, an excellent question. And yes, there are. And however, having said that, the scale, when you think of the scale of the collection that I look after, we actually have a very, very small number of surviving cases. So every single piece of Fabergé was retailed in a beautiful, usually pale blonde wood box, lined in silk and silk velvet, stamped with the imperial warrant, which also helps us to date the objects sometimes if they're unmarked. And these were perfectly made. There was a separate workshop at Fabergé's headquarters in St. Petersburg, especially. All they did was to make these boxes. They really were beautiful. And so in a sense, it's kind of, disappointing in a way that we have so few of them surviving in the Royal Collection. But some of the ones we do are for the most important pieces. And indeed, for the colonnade egg, the wonderful temple egg, we actually have that original case, and I think it's just a wonderful survival from that period of history, and it's a very beautiful egg-shaped box, covered in velvet and lined in silk, and we still use it to move the egg around today.